Welcome back to another edition of Dave Smith Unleashed, and make sure you like, comment, and subscribe on our YouTube page at the Dave Smith Unleashed Podcast, at the Dave Smith Unleashed Podcast. And you want to know when the next show is going to be, who the guest is going to be, what time and what day? Well, then you want to go to my X page, my Twitter page, at Dave Sports Guy. So follow us on YouTube at the Dave Smith Unleashed Podcast. Also on Twitter at Dave Sports Guy. And I love kicking it around with you in the comment section on both of them. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you share, make sure you listen on the YouTube page. You know, an argument that comes up frequently, and I've talked about this a lot on my radio show over the years, and I was in an argument the other day with a couple of guys at the gym. And the subject came up of who was the better NBA center, Shaq or Wilt. You know, living out here in Los Angeles, that comes up all the time since they were both superstars of the Lakers and won world championships. Now, the younger generation all says Shaq. And they say Shaq's the MDE, most dominant ever, because, you know, and which is bullshit. And as I used to say on the radio, Shaq says it, the media prints it, and people believe it. He is not the most dominant ever. What he was a dominant low-post offensive player. But to be the MDE, the most dominant ever, you got to do it on both ends. You got to play hard. You got to rebound black shots and defend, three things that he did not do. So, no, he was not the most dominant player, and I would make a case. I'm going to do this on another podcast as well. I'd make the case that Tim Duncan was the most dominant player of his generation, not Shaq, because Duncan did it on both ends of the floor. Okay, but let's get back to the argument of the day here. Wilt versus Shaq. Who was the better NBA center? Okay, let's start with comparing some career numbers here. Dave Smith Unleashed brought to you by MTS Transportations. And mention the Dave Smith Unleashed podcast and get 20% off on your next shipment for all your shipping, trucking, and freight needs. There's only one business to call, and that's MTS Transportations at 800-640-6873. MTS Transportations, 800-640-6873. Wilt Chamberlain, career average, 31 points a game. 23 rebounds. Think about that. He averaged 23 rebounds a game for his career. I mean, you get 11 or 12 now, you lead the league these days. 23 for a career. 54% field goal percentage, 51% free throw percentage. He was a horrible free throw shooter. And he had 31,419 points. Okay, Shaq. He averaged 24 points a game over his career and 11 rebounds. So about fewer points a game than Wilt and 12 less rebounds a game. 58% field goal percentage, 52% free throw percentage. Both of them were horrendous free throw shooters. And 28,596 points for Shaq, a little bit behind Wilt. So you look at the career numbers, you know, Wilt's got him, especially when you consider rebounding, of course. Now let's go to the postseason. How do they play in the postseason? Well, Shaq has 4 championships and Wilt only has 2. So you give an edge to Shaq there. And Shaq averaged 24 points, 11.6 rebounds, 56% field goal percentage, 50% field goal percentage. So he averaged about a half point a game more and about a half a rebound a game more in the postseason. Wilt Chamberlain's postseason numbers. 22.5 points per game. 25 rebounds. He averaged 25 rebounds a game in the postseason over his long career. 52% field goal percentage, 47% free throw percentage. And, of course, Shaq has the 4 titles and Wilt only has 2. Now, a lot of people say to me, yeah, but Dave, Wilt played against 6'6" white guys, and he dominated a bunch of short white guys, janitors and librarians and gas station workers, which is complete and total bullshit. Anybody who's done a modicum of research knows that isn't true. Only an idiot would say Wilt played against inferior competition. Now let's go over their opponents, their top opponents in their careers. Wilt Chamberlain, and remember this: when Wilt came into the NBA, there were 8 teams in the league, and by the time he retired in '73, there were 17. But until 1966, there were 8 teams in the league. Then they expanded slowly after that, and it got up to 17 by '73. So he was going up against much better competition. With only 8 teams in the league, you're going up against the other team's best center every night. And I would argue that the centers in Wilt's era were better than the centers in Shaq's era. Now, let's go over them center by center, okay? Here's who Wilt played against. Now, 6'6" white guys, huh? Okay. Bill Russell, 6'10". A lot of people argue the greatest player in the history of the NBA. He's the greatest winner in the history of the NBA with 11 titles in 13 years. Kareem, yeah, there's another short white guy, right? 7'2". You can make an argument that he's the greatest center in the history of the NBA. Walt Bellamy and Nate Thurman, both Hall of Famers, both 7-footers, both tremendous all-time greats. Bob Lanier, another Hall of Famer, another 7-footer. Yeah, there's another short white guy, right? Artis Gilmore, 7'2", Hall of Famer, one of the all-time greats. Elvin Hayes, 6'10", 6'11", Hall of Famer, top 10 in the NBA in scoring all time. Willis Reed, 6'10", Hall of Fame, one of the all-time greats. And Wes Unseld, he's the only short guy on the list at 6'7", but he was great. He was a Hall of Fame center. So let's go over all these short white guys again, shall we? Bill Russell, Kareem, Walt Bellamy, Nate Thurman, Bob Lanier, Artis Gilmore, Elvin Hayes, Wes Unseld, Willis Reed. That's the greatest collection of centers in NBA history. And Wilt was playing in an 8-team league, which means almost every night he was going up against a Hall of Famer. There were no nights off. There were no breathers when the league's that small and there were that many great centers around. Let's go over Shaq's opposition. David Robinson, Hall of Famer. Hakeem Olajuwon, Hall of Famer. Patrick Ewing, Hall of Famer. Alonzo Mourning, I think he's in the Hall of Fame. Yao Ming, borderline. He didn't have a long career. I don't think he's in the Hall of Fame yet. Rick Smits is not a Hall of Famer, but he was a very good offensive player at 7'4". So David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, Alonzo Mourning, Yao Ming, Rick Smits. I would put the centers Wilt played against over that group, as great as some of them are. And here's the thing. How many teams were in the league when Shaq was playing? Well, there were 27 when he came into the NBA, and there were 30 by the time he retired. 27 when he came into the league in 1992, and by the time Wilt retired, there were 30. And they went to 30, I think it was in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, 2004, 2005. So Shaq had a lot of nights off. I mean, when there's 30 teams in the league and only 3 or 4 good centers in the NBA at one time, that means 26 times out of 30, Shaq had a breather going up against a stiff every night. Now compare that to Wilt. In an 8-team league, Wilt was going up against a Hall of Famer almost every night. There's no nights off for Wilt. He was going up against great competition almost every single game. So I'd make the argument Wilt went up against better competition and certainly more often in an 8-team league. Way more often. Now let's go over some of the individual awards between Wilt and Shaq. Shaq, 3 times finals MVP. All 3 of those Shaq-Kobe titles, he was the MVP. 1 league MVP, Rookie of the Year, 2-time scoring champion. But here's the glaring weakness here. He never led the NBA in rebounding, not one time. He never led the NBA in blocks, not one time. He was never first team all defense, not one time. So if you call yourself the most dominant ever, and you're 7'2" and 300 pounds and a great athlete, how can you never once lead the league in rebounding, blocks, or be first team all defense and have the nerve to call yourself the MDE, most dominant ever? He certainly was not. He was not a good defender. He was not a good rebounder, and he was not a good shot blocker. He basically played one end of the floor. Yes, he was dominant down on the low post. There's no doubt about it. But Bill Russell was dominant on both ends. Wilt was dominant on both ends. Tim Duncan was dominant on both ends, and some other NBA centers I can name as well. Not Shaq. So the individual awards, we just went over Shaq. Here's Wilt's individual awards. 11-time rebounding champion. Led the league in rebounds 11 times. How many times did Shaq lead the league in rebounding? That would be a 0. He was the finals MVP once. Shaq was the finals MVP 3 times. Wilt was 4-time NBA MVP. Shaq was MVP once. They were both Rookie of the Year. Wilt was a 7-time scoring champion. Shaq was a 2-time scoring champion. And here's a big one here. Wilt Chamberlain, unbelievably, one year led the NBA in assists. The greatest scorer and rebounder of his generation, rebounding along with Bill Russell, led the league in assists one year as a 7'2" center, which is incredible. Did Wilt ever win Defensive Player of the Year? No, he did not. But you know what? You want to know why? Because the NBA didn't vote on a Defensive Player of the Year until 1982-83 season. Certainly, he would have won a bunch of them, probably splitting with Bill Russell back in the day. How many times did Wilt lead the NBA in blocks? Well, none, because they didn't keep blocks as a statistic until 1974, the year after Wilt retired. I guarantee you he led the NBA in blocks maybe 10 times when he played. He and Bill Russell both. So there's no comparison on the defensive end of the floor. Wilt, an 11-time rebounding champion, one of the great shot blockers of all time, great defensive player, elite, one of the top defensive players in the history of the NBA. Were they both good offensively? Yes. Were they both dominant down low? Yes. Did they both play both ends of the floor? No, Shaq did not. So to me, this is an easy one, and I would love to know what you think. All you subscribers out there at The Dave Smith Podcast on YouTube, at The Dave Smith Podcast on YouTube, or go to the Twitter X page at Dave Sports Guy. To me, this is an easy one. Is it a slap at Shaq? No, Shaq was a great player, a Hall of Famer, top 50 of all time. Certainly, I don't have him in my top 10 of all time in the NBA, but top 15, top 20, without question. He had a great career, 3 championships, and he's about as good an athlete at 7'2" as I've ever seen since Wilt. But he was always out of shape. He didn't do it on the defensive end of the floor. He didn't rebound. He didn't block shots. And he was lazy defensively. He only played hard on one end of the floor. Wilt played hard on both ends of the floor. Wilt dominated offensively and defensively. 23 rebounds a game for his career, 25 in the playoffs. And for all of you idiots who want to tell me that, well, Wilt played against 6'6" white guys. Wilt didn't play against the level of competition that Shaq did. Here's all the short white guys Wilt played against. Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Walt Bellamy, Nate Thurman, Bob Lanier, Artis Gilmore, Elvin Hayes, Wes Unseld, Willis Reed. Yeah, bunch of short little white guys there, huh? Feed that to any of these idiots who say Wilt didn't play against anybody. Oh, he played against a bunch of part-time players, 6'6" white guys who were janitors and accountants in the offseason. So that's it for me. I would love to kick it around with you and get your comments. Give me your comments on the YouTube page at the Dave Smith Unleashed Podcast and on Twitter at Dave Sports Guy. I'd love to kick it around with you. Love to see what you're having to say and go back and forth, agree or disagree. And I love a good spirited debate if you disagree with me as well. But to me, the verdict is in. It's clear-cut and it's not even close. Wilt Chamberlain was by far a better NBA center than Shaquille O'Neal, and that answers the question. That's it for me, Dave Smith, on Dave Smith Unleashed, the Dave Smith Unleashed podcast, and we'll talk to you next time.